Welcome back to the Historian's Tome, where ancient stories help you drift into peaceful sleep. Tonight, we journey to the highlands of East Africa to discover the Kingdom of Aksum, a powerful civilization that once ruled over vast lands and controlled important trade routes. Before we begin, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more historical sleep stories. We would love to know where you are watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. Now get comfortable, close your eyes, and let the story of Aksum carry you into restful dreams. In the northern highlands of what is now Ethiopia and Eritrea, a great kingdom began to take shape around the 1st century of the Common Era. This was Aksum, a land of green valleys and high plateaus where the air was cool and the soil was fertile. The people who lived here had been farming and trading for many generations, but now something new was happening. Small villages were growing into towns, and towns were becoming cities. The land itself seemed blessed by nature. Rain fell regularly on the highlands, feeding streams that flowed down mountain sides. Farmers grew wheat and barley in terraced fields. They raised cattle and goats on grassy slopes. The people knew how to work with the land, and the land gave them what they needed to build something lasting. But it was not just farming that made Aksum special. The kingdom sat in a perfect location between two worlds. To the west lay the African interior with its gold, ivory, and exotic goods. To the east, just a short distance away, was the Red Sea coast. This coast connected Aksum to the vast trading networks that stretched across the Indian Ocean to India, Arabia, and beyond. The early Aksumites were skilled at taking advantage of this location. They built a port called Adulis on the Red Sea coast. This port became one of the busiest trading centers in the entire region. Ships arrived carrying silk from China, spices from India, and wine from the Roman Empire. These goods were unloaded and carried up into the highlands, where Aksumite merchants decided what to keep and what to send further inland into Africa. The people of Aksum were also sending out their own goods. Ivory from elephant tusks was highly prized in distant lands. Gold dust and nuggets from African mines passed through Aksumite hands. Frankincense and myrrh, the fragrant tree resins used in religious ceremonies, grew in the region and were exported far and wide. Obsidian, a volcanic glass used for tools and decoration, was another valuable export. As trade grew, so did the city of Aksum itself. The capital, also called Aksum, began to rise from the highland plateau. Stone buildings replaced simple huts. Craftsmen carved decorations into walls and doorways. The wealthy built larger homes with many rooms. Markets filled with goods from across the known world appeared in the city center. The rulers of Aksum began to see themselves as more than just local chiefs. They called themselves kings, and they wanted everyone to know about their power and importance. They began to mint their own coins, a privilege usually reserved for the greatest kingdoms and empires. These coins showed the faces of Aksumite kings and carried messages in different languages, proving that Aksum was connected to many cultures. The kings also built monuments to show their greatness. The most impressive of these monuments were the giant stone pillars called stelae. These pillars were carved from single pieces of stone and stood taller than any building. Some reached heights of over 70 feet. They were decorated with carvings that looked like multi-story buildings, complete with windows, doors, and even imitation wooden beams, all carved from solid rock. Creating these stelae required incredible skill and organization. Workers had to find the right stone, cut it from quarries, shape it with tools, and then transport it to where it would stand. The largest stelae weighed hundreds of tons. Moving such massive stones without modern machinery required hundreds of workers pulling together with ropes and using wooden rollers and sledges. The society that was forming in Aksum had different levels. At the top were the kings and their families. Below them were nobles who owned land and controlled villages. Merchants formed another important group, as they brought wealth into the kingdom through trade. Craftsmen and artisans made the goods that Aksum needed and traded. Farmers worked the land and provided food for everyone. And at the bottom were servants and slaves, many of whom had been captured in wars or bought from slave traders. Religion played an important role in early Aksumite life. Before Christianity arrived, the people worshipped many gods. The most important was Astar, a god associated with the planet Venus. There was also Marem, a war god who was believed to protect the kingdom. Behar, the god of the earth and sea, was honored as well. People made offerings to these gods at temples and asked for their help with crops, trade, and battles. The language spoken in Aksum was called Ge'ez. This language had its own writing system, which was adapted from scripts used in South Arabia. The Aksumites used this writing to keep records, write contracts, and create inscriptions on their monuments. Being able to write gave Aksum a huge advantage. Records could be kept accurately. Messages could be sent across distances. Knowledge could be preserved for future generations. As the first century turned into the second, Aksum continued to grow stronger. More villages came under the control of Aksumite kings. The trade networks expanded. The capital city became more impressive with each passing year. The people of Aksum were building something that would last for centuries, a kingdom that would become one of the great powers of the ancient world. By the 3rd century, Aksum had transformed from a local power into a kingdom that demanded respect from distant lands. The kings of Aksum now ruled over a territory that stretched from the Red Sea coast deep into the African interior. They controlled important trade routes and had become wealthy beyond imagination. One of the greatest kings of this period was Gadarat. His name appears on coins and inscriptions, and he seems to have ruled during a time of great expansion. Gadarat called himself the King of Kings, a title that showed he ruled over other, lesser kings. This was more than just boasting. Aksum had indeed brought many smaller kingdoms and tribes under its control. The military power of Aksum was a key factor in this rise. The kingdom maintained a strong army that could march across difficult terrain and fight in different types of conditions. Aksumite soldiers were known for their discipline and bravery. They fought with spears, swords, and bows. The kingdom also had war elephants, which were terrifying weapons in ancient warfare. These massive animals could break through enemy lines and cause panic among opposing forces. Aksum began to extend its influence across the Red Sea into Arabia. The southern part of the Arabian Peninsula was close enough that Aksumite kings could send armies there when needed. Several times over the centuries, Aksum conquered parts of what is now Yemen. These military campaigns were often connected to trade. By controlling both sides of the Red Sea, Aksum could make sure that trade flowed smoothly and that the kingdom received its share of profits. The relationship with the Roman Empire was another important factor in Aksum's rise. The Romans needed goods from Africa and Asia, and Aksum was perfectly positioned to provide them. Roman merchants traveled to Aksumite ports and bought ivory, gold, spices, and other luxury items. In return, they brought Roman glass, wine, olive oil, and manufactured goods. This trade enriched both sides, but it especially helped Aksum grow wealthy. A Roman writer named Mani, who lived in the 3rd century, listed Aksum as one of the 4 great kingdoms of the world, along with Rome, Persia, and China. This was high praise indeed. For a kingdom in Africa to be mentioned alongside these famous empires showed just how important Aksum had become in the eyes of the wider world. The port of Adulis continued to be the gateway for all this trade. The city grew into a bustling metropolis where people from many cultures met and did business. You could walk through the markets of Adulis and hear Greek, Arabic, Ge'ez, and languages from India being spoken. Ships crowded the harbor, their sails filling the sky. Warehouses stored goods waiting to be sent up to the highlands or loaded onto ships bound for distant ports. The wealth from trade allowed the kings of Aksum to build on an even grander scale. Palaces rose in the capital with many rooms, courtyards, and towers. These palaces were built from stone and featured impressive architecture. Some had water systems that brought fresh water from nearby streams. The floors were paved with stone, and the walls were sometimes plastered and painted with decorations. The common people of Aksum also benefited from the kingdom's prosperity, though to a lesser degree. Cities and towns had markets where goods from around the world could be purchased. Even ordinary farmers might own items that had come from distant lands. The population grew as more people were born and as others moved to Aksum seeking opportunities. Religious life continued to be centered on the old gods, but there were also Jewish communities in Aksum. These communities had their own synagogues and followed their own religious practices. The kings of Aksum tolerated different religions, understanding that traders from many backgrounds brought wealth to the kingdom. The Aksumite kings also developed a sophisticated system of government. They appointed governors to rule over different regions of the kingdom. These governors collected taxes, maintained order, and made sure that the king's laws were followed. Tax collectors gathered portions of harvests from farmers and fees from merchants. This revenue supported the army, paid for building projects, and enriched the royal family. Communication across the kingdom was maintained through a system of roads and messengers. While the roads were not paved like Roman roads, they were well maintained and allowed for relatively quick travel. Royal messengers carried orders from the king to distant parts of the realm. This system helped keep the kingdom unified even as it grew larger. By the end of the 3rd century, Aksum stood as a major power in its region. The kingdom had proven it could compete with the great empires of the time. Its merchants were welcomed in ports around the Red Sea and Indian Ocean. Its army could project power across the Red Sea and into neighboring lands. The kings of Aksum had built something impressive, and the kingdom was about to enter its golden age. The 4th century brought a change that would transform Aksum forever. Christianity came to the kingdom, and eventually it became the official religion of the state. This change happened gradually and was connected to both politics and personal faith. The story of how Christianity came to Aksum is told in ancient texts written by church historians. According to these accounts, a Christian philosopher named Meropius was traveling with 2 young boys named Frumentius and Aedesius. Their ship stopped on the African coast, possibly near Adulis. Local people attacked the ship and killed most of those aboard, but the 2 boys were spared and brought to the royal court in Aksum. The king at that time saw that the boys were educated and intelligent. He made them part of the royal household. Frumentius became the king's secretary and advisor, while Aedesius became the royal cupbearer. The boys grew up in the palace and became trusted members of the court. When the old king died, his widow asked Frumentius and Aedesius to stay and help her young son rule until he came of age. Frumentius agreed and effectively became one of the most powerful people in the kingdom. During this time, he used his influence to support Christian merchants who came to Aksum. He helped them establish meeting places where they could worship and encourage the spread of Christian ideas. Eventually, Frumentius traveled to Alexandria in Egypt, which was one of the main centers of Christianity in the ancient world. There, he met with the patriarch Athanasius and told him about Aksum. Athanasius decided to make Frumentius the first bishop of Aksum and sent him back to continue spreading Christianity in the kingdom. The king who is most closely associated with the adoption of Christianity was Ezana. He ruled during the middle of the 4th century and was possibly the young prince whom Frumentius had helped raise. During his reign, Ezana made Christianity the official religion of Aksum. This was a momentous decision that changed the course of the kingdom's history. Ezana's conversion can be tracked through his coins. Earlier coins from his reign show the traditional crescent and disc symbols associated with the old gods. Later coins show the Christian cross, making Aksum one of the first kingdoms anywhere to put Christian symbols on its money. Inscriptions from Ezana's reign also show this change. Early inscriptions invoke the old gods, while later ones invoke the Christian god. The adoption of Christianity connected Aksum more closely to the Roman Empire, which had recently become Christian itself. This religious connection strengthened political and trade relationships. Christian merchants from the Roman Empire felt more comfortable trading with a Christian kingdom. Religious pilgrims began to include Aksum in their travels. The kingdom became part of the broader Christian world that stretched around the Mediterranean Sea. Churches began to be built throughout Aksum. These early churches were impressive stone structures with thick walls and tall towers. They were decorated with crosses and religious artwork. The most important church was in the capital city, and it became a center of religious and political life. Kings were crowned in this church, and important state ceremonies were held there. The old religion did not disappear overnight. In the countryside, many people continued to worship the traditional gods for some time, but gradually Christianity spread throughout the kingdom. Priests traveled to villages to baptize people and teach them about the new faith. The Bible was translated into Ge'ez so that Aksumites could read it in their own language. Monasteries began to appear in the highlands. These were places where monks lived together, praying and studying religious texts. The monasteries became centers of learning. Monks copied manuscripts by hand, preserving religious texts and other knowledge. They also developed a tradition of religious music and chanting that continues in Ethiopian Christianity to this day. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church, which grew from these early beginnings, developed its own unique character. It blended Christian teachings with local traditions. The Church kept certain practices from Jewish law, such as dietary restrictions and the observance of the Sabbath on Saturday. It also placed great importance on the Ark of the Covenant, which Ethiopian tradition claims was brought to Aksum from Jerusalem in ancient times. King Ezana was not only important for his religious changes, but also for his military conquests. He led successful campaigns against neighboring kingdoms and expanded Aksum's territory. One of his most famous victories was over the Kingdom of Kush, which lay to the northwest along the Nile River. Kush had been a powerful kingdom for over 1,000 years, but Ezana's forces defeated it, bringing an end to one of Africa's oldest civilizations. Inscriptions from Ezana's reign describe his victories in detail. These inscriptions were carved on stone stelae and placed where people could see them. They were written in 3 languages, Ge'ez, Greek, and an Arabian language. This multilingual approach showed that Aksum was an international kingdom that communicated with many different peoples. The conversion to Christianity had lasting effects on Aksumite art and culture. The cross became a common symbol in artwork. Religious themes appeared in paintings and carvings. Saints and biblical scenes were depicted in churches. This Christian art blended local artistic traditions with styles from the broader Christian world, creating something unique to Aksum. By the end of the 4th century, Aksum was firmly Christian. The kingdom had entered a new phase of its history. It was now connected to the wider Christian world while still maintaining its unique African identity. The coming centuries would see Aksum reach the height of its power, and Christianity would be at the center of that golden age. The 5th and 6th centuries were the golden age of Aksum. During this time, the kingdom reached the peak of its power, wealth, and influence. Aksumite kings ruled over vast territories, controlled crucial trade routes, and played important roles in international politics. The capital city of Aksum during this period was an impressive sight. At its height, the city may have been home to 20,000 people or more. This was a very large population for an ancient city. The city center was filled with impressive buildings. Palaces with multiple stories and many rooms dominated the skyline. Stone houses for wealthy families lined the streets. Markets bustled with activity as merchants sold goods from around the known world. The most striking features of the city were the towering stelae. The great stelae, if it had remained standing, would have been over 100 feet tall and weighed more than 500 tons. It fell possibly during construction or shortly after being erected. The stelae that still stands as the tallest is over 70 feet high. These massive monuments, carved to look like multi-story buildings, were placed at the entrance to underground tombs where kings and nobles were buried. Trade continued to be the lifeblood of Aksum's wealth. The kingdom exported ivory in huge quantities. Elephants roamed the forests of the interior, and skilled hunters tracked them down. The ivory trade was so important that Aksumite ports became known as the best places to buy high-quality ivory. Gold also flowed through Aksum, coming from mine in the interior and being shipped out to eager buyers in the Roman Empire and beyond. Aksumite coins from this period are works of art. They were made of gold, silver, and bronze, and they show the faces of kings wearing elaborate crowns. The inscriptions on the coins were in Greek, showing that Aksum was engaged with the Hellenistic world. Some coins show kings holding crosses, emphasizing the Christian faith of the kingdom. These coins have been found in places as far away as India, proving the extent of Aksumite trade connections. One of the most powerful kings of this golden age was Kaleb, who ruled in the early 6th century. Kaleb is remembered for a military campaign that showed just how far Aksum's power could reach. Across the Red Sea in Yemen, which was then called Himyar, a king named Du-Nuwas had come to power. Du-Nuwas was Jewish, and he began persecuting Christians in his kingdom. Reports of these persecutions reached the Christian world and caused outrage. Kaleb, as a Christian king, decided to act. He assembled a large army and a fleet of ships. This fleet crossed the Red Sea and landed in Yemen. The Aksumite forces defeated Du-Nuwas in battle, and the Himyarite king died. Kaleb installed a Christian ruler in Yemen and left Aksumite troops there to maintain control. This intervention was supported by the Byzantine Empire, which was the eastern continuation of the Roman Empire and was also Christian. The conquest of Yemen was a high point of Aksumite power. For several decades, Aksum controlled territory on both sides of the Red Sea. This gave the kingdom nearly complete control over the trade routes passing through the region. Ships had to pay taxes to Aksumite officials, whether they were on the African or Arabian side of the sea. But controlling Yemen proved difficult. The Arabian province was far from Aksum, and maintaining an army there was expensive. Local rebellions broke out. Eventually, the Byzantines and the Persians began to compete for influence in the region, and Aksum's control weakened. By the late 6th century, Aksum had lost its direct control over Yemen, though it continued to have influence in the region. During the Golden Age, Aksum also maintained diplomatic relations with other great powers. Ambassadors traveled between Aksum and the Byzantine Empire, carrying gifts and messages. The Byzantine Emperor Justinian, who is considered one of the greatest Roman emperors, exchanged letters with King Kaleb. These two Christian monarchs saw each other as allies in a world where they faced challenges from non-Christian powers. Life in Aksum during this period was comfortable for those who were wealthy. Large stone houses had many rooms arranged around courtyards. The houses had bathrooms with drainage systems. Walls were plastered and sometimes painted with designs. Floors were paved with stone or covered with carpets and rugs imported from abroad. Wealthy Aksumites ate off of fine pottery and drank from glass vessels. The arts flourished during the Golden Age. Craftsmen created beautiful objects from gold, silver, and bronze. Stone carvers created intricate decorations for churches and palaces. Weavers made cloth from cotton and silk. Writers composed texts in Ge'ez, including religious works, histories, and laws. This cultural production showed that Aksum was not just powerful militarily and economically, but was also a center of civilization. Religious life was central to Aksumite society during this time. Churches were being built throughout the kingdom, not just in the capital, but in smaller towns and even villages. These churches became gathering places for communities. People attended services regularly, listening to priests read from the Bible in Ge'ez and explain Christian teachings. Religious festivals marked the calendar, giving people reasons to celebrate and take breaks from work. The countryside surrounding Aksum was productive during these centuries. Farmers grew crops on terraced hillsides, preventing soil erosion and maximizing the use of land. They cultivated wheat, barley, and teff, a grain native to Ethiopia. Orchards produced fruits. Herders raised cattle, sheep, and goats. The agricultural surplus supported the large urban population and provided goods for trade. Education was becoming more important, especially for those who wanted positions in the government or church. Young men from wealthy families learned to read and write Ge'ez. They studied religious texts and learned mathematics and other practical skills. The church played a major role in education, as priests needed to be literate to read the Bible and perform their duties. This meant that monasteries and churches often had schools attached to them. By the end of the 6th century, Aksum stood as one of the great kingdoms of the world. It had survived for more than 5 centuries and had grown from a small highland kingdom into an international power. Its merchants traded across the Indian Ocean. Its armies could project power across the Red Sea. Its culture was rich and distinctive. But changes were coming that would challenge Aksum's dominance. The 7th century brought new challenges that would test Aksum's strength. The world was changing, and these changes would eventually affect even this powerful highland kingdom. The most significant change was the rise of Islam, a new religion that emerged in Arabia and quickly spread across the Middle East and beyond. The Prophet Muhammad began preaching in Mecca in the early 7th century. His message of submission to one God and a way of life based on divine revelation attracted followers but also created enemies. When persecution of early Muslims became severe in Mecca, some of Muhammad's followers needed a safe place to go. According to Islamic tradition, Muhammad told them to seek refuge in Aksum, which he described as a land ruled by a just king where no one was wronged. A group of Muslims crossed the Red Sea and came to Aksum as refugees. The king at that time, who may have been named Amr, received them hospitably. When the leaders of Mecca sent ambassadors demanding that the Muslims be returned, the Aksumite king refused. He listened to both sides and decided that the Muslims should be allowed to stay in safety. This act of tolerance is remembered with gratitude in Islamic tradition, and Ethiopia is therefore spoken of with respect in Islamic history. However, the rise of Islam would eventually have negative consequences for Aksum. As Islam spread rapidly after Muhammad's death in 632, Muslim armies conquered vast territories. They took control of Egypt, Syria, Palestine, and Mesopotamia. They pushed eastward into Persia and westward across North Africa. Within a few decades, much of the known world had come under Islamic rule. These conquests changed the patterns of trade that had enriched Aksum for centuries. The trade routes that had connected East Africa to the Mediterranean and beyond were now controlled by Muslim powers. Muslim merchants began to dominate the trade of the Red Sea and Indian Ocean. Aksumite merchants found themselves increasingly cut off from their traditional trading partners. The port of Adulis, which had been the gateway for Aksum's trade, began to decline. Ships now preferred to stop at ports controlled by Muslim rulers. The taxes and wealth that had flowed through Adulis dried up. Without the revenues from trade, the kingdom had less money to maintain its army, build monuments, or support its cities. Aksum also faced challenges from within its own region. To the south, new powers were rising. Groups that had previously been under Aksumite control were becoming more independent. Some even began to challenge Aksum's authority directly. The kingdom had to fight wars to maintain its territory, and these wars were expensive and did not always end in victory. The kingdom's influence in Arabia was also coming to an end. The territories across the Red Sea that Aksum had once controlled were now firmly in Muslim hands. There was no possibility of Aksumite armies crossing the Red Sea to intervene in Arabian affairs, as they had done in the time of King Kaleb. Aksum was being pushed back to its core territories in the highlands. Climate may have also played a role in Aksum's difficulties during this period. Some evidence suggests that the climate became drier in the region during the 7th century. If less rain fell, then crops would have been less productive. Farmers would have produced less surplus, which meant less food for city dwellers and less to trade. While the evidence for climate change is not definitive, it is possible that environmental factors added to Aksum's problems. The population of the capital city began to decline. Without the wealth from trade, there was less reason for people to live in a large urban center. Some people moved away, perhaps returning to farming villages or seeking opportunities elsewhere. Buildings fell into disrepair. The great days of construction were over, and no new massive stelae were erected. The kings of Aksum during this period left fewer records than their predecessors. We know less about their names, their deeds, and their accomplishments. This itself is a sign of decline. Earlier kings had been eager to proclaim their victories and have their names remembered. The fact that fewer inscriptions and coins were produced suggests that the kingdom had fewer resources and less power. Despite these challenges, Aksum did not collapse suddenly. The kingdom continued to exist, but it was weaker and less influential than it had been during its golden age. The Christian church remained strong and provided continuity even as political power waned. Monasteries continued to operate, and monks continued to copy manuscripts and preserve knowledge. Religious festivals still brought communities together. Trade did not disappear entirely, but it was a shadow of what it had been. Some merchants still brought goods up from the coast, but the volume was much smaller. The kingdom still produced some goods for export, but there was less demand and fewer buyers. Aksumite coins stopped being minted in gold and were made only in bronze, suggesting a decline in wealth. The capital city of Aksum remained inhabited, but it was no longer the bustling metropolis it had been. The palaces still stood, but they were maintained less carefully. The churches continued to hold services and people still came to worship, but there was less splendor than before. The great stelae stood as reminders of past glory, silent witnesses to the changes that had occurred. During the 8th and 9th centuries, Aksum entered a period of obscurity. The kingdom became more isolated from the wider world. While Christian communities in places like Egypt and Syria came under Muslim rule and had to adapt to new circumstances, the highlands of Ethiopia remained Christian and independent. This isolation helped preserve Christianity in the region, but also cut the kingdom off from developments elsewhere. New threats emerged from within Africa. A queen known in legend as Gudit or Judith led a fierce campaign against Aksum sometime around the 10th century. The details of this conflict are unclear and different sources give different accounts, but it appears that Aksum suffered serious damage. Churches were destroyed, and the royal line may have been disrupted. This attack is sometimes seen as the final blow to Aksum's power as a major kingdom. By the end of the first millennium, Aksum, as a great power, was no more. The kingdom still existed in some form and the region remained inhabited, but the glory days were long past. The focus of power in Christian Ethiopia was shifting southward to new regions. New dynasties would rise and claim to be the heirs of Aksum's legacy, but the kingdom itself was fading into history. To understand Aksum fully, we must look beyond kings and battles to see how ordinary people lived. Life in Aksumite society varied greatly depending on whether you were rich or poor, whether you lived in the city or the countryside, and what role you played in the economy. For farmers, who made up the majority of the population, life centered on the agricultural cycle. The highlands of Aksum had good soil and received regular rainfall, which made farming possible. The rainy season came during the summer months, and farmers planted their crops to take advantage of these rains. Wheat and barley were the main grain crops. Teff, a tiny grain native to Ethiopia, was also important and is still a staple food in the region today. Farmers worked small plots of land, often on hillsides that had been terraced to prevent erosion. They used simple tools like wooden plows pulled by oxen. Planting was done by hand, with family members walking through fields and dropping seeds into furrows. Weeding was constant work during the growing season. Harvesting was a communal activity with neighbors helping each other bring in the crops. Besides crops, farmers raised animals. Cattle were valuable for ploughing, for milk, and for meat. Goats and sheep provided milk, meat, and wool. Chickens were kept for eggs. Donkeys and mules were used for carrying loads. The number of animals a family owned was a sign of their wealth. A farmer with many cattle was respected in the community. Farm families lived in simple houses made from stone and wood with thatched roofs. These houses usually had just 1 or 2 rooms. The family slept together on raised platforms or mats on the floor. Cooking was done over an open fire, often in the center of the main room, with smoke escaping through holes in the roof or door. Furniture was minimal, perhaps consisting of a few stools and storage baskets. The diet of farming families was simple but adequate. Injera, a spongy flatbread made from teff flour, was and still is the staple food of the region. This bread is fermented before cooking, giving it a slightly sour taste. Farmers ate injera with stews made from lentils, beans, or vegetables. Meat was eaten only occasionally, usually during festivals or special occasions. Milk and dairy products were important parts of the diet. In the cities, life was quite different. Wealthy merchants and nobles lived in large stone houses with multiple rooms. These homes had courtyards, storage rooms, and sometimes separate quarters for servants. The walls were plastered and sometimes painted with decorations. Windows had wooden shutters. Some houses had systems to collect rainwater or brought in water from nearby springs. The wealthy ate much better than farmers. They had access to meat more regularly, including beef, goat, and chicken. They could afford imported foods like olive oil, wine, and spices. They ate from pottery dishes and drank from glass cups. Their meals were more varied and flavorful than what ordinary people ate. Markets were the centers of urban life. In the capital city and in smaller towns, markets were held regularly where people came to buy and sell goods. You could find local produce like grains, vegetables, and fruits. There were animals for sale, both living and butchered. Craftsmen sold their wares, including pottery, cloth, metal tools, and leather goods. Merchants displayed imported luxuries like silk, glass, and jewelry. Craftsmen and artisans occupied an important middle position in society. Blacksmiths who worked with iron and bronze were essential as they made tools, weapons, and household items. Potters created vessels for storing and cooking food. Weavers made cloth from cotton and wool. Leather workers made sandals, bags, and other items. These craftsmen often worked in specialized quarters of cities where workshops clustered together. Stone carvers were among the most respected craftsmen. They created the decorative elements for churches and palaces. They carved the massive stelae that required incredible skill. Stone carving was demanding work that required years of training. Master carvers passed their skills down to apprentices who learned the trade over many years. The royal court was at the top of society. The king lived in a grand palace with many attendants and servants. He wore fine clothes and jewelry. The crown of an Aksumite king was elaborate, often shown on coins with pendants hanging down. The king sat on a throne when receiving visitors and conducting official business. Royal ceremonies were elaborate affairs with music, dancing, and feasting. Nobles and important officials surrounded the king. These men owned large amounts of land and controlled many villages. They lived in substantial stone houses in the capital and had country estates as well. They dressed in fine robes and adorned themselves with jewelry. They attended the king and advised him on matters of state. Their sons often served in the army as officers or in the government as administrators. Women's roles in Aksumite society varied by class. Noble women lived sheltered lives in their homes, but could own property and had some influence through their husbands and sons. Women of ordinary families worked alongside men in fields and in household industries. They ground grain, cooked meals, cared for children, and made cloth. Some women worked as servants in wealthy households. Women generally had fewer rights than men, but they were not without status in the community. Children in farming families began helping with work at a young age. Young children might watch over animals or help with simple tasks. As they grew older, boys learned farming from their fathers, while girls learned household skills from their mothers. In wealthy families, boys might receive an education, learning to read and write. Girls from wealthy families learned the skills needed to manage a household. Slavery existed in Aksum, though we do not know exactly how widespread it was. Slaves might be prisoners captured in war, people bought from slave traders, or those who had fallen into slavery through debt. Slaves worked in households, in fields, and at various labor tasks. Their conditions varied depending on their owners. Some slaves were treated relatively well, while others suffered harsh treatment. Religion touched every aspect of life. The Christian faith provided a framework for understanding the world and a set of rules for living. People attended church services regularly, especially on Sundays and holy days. The church calendar marked the passing of time with festivals and fasting periods. Priests performed baptisms, marriages, and funerals, marking the important transitions in people's lives. Music and dance were important parts of Aksumite culture. Religious music was performed in churches, with priests and deacons chanting hymns in Ge'ez. Drums, stringed instruments, and sistrums, which are a type of rattle, provided accompaniment. Secular music was played at festivals and celebrations. People danced at weddings and other happy occasions. The language of daily life in Aksum was Ge'ez, though other languages were also spoken in different parts of the kingdom. Ge'ez was written using a unique script that had symbols for different syllables. Literacy was limited mainly to priests, scribes, and wealthy men who had received education. Most people could not read or write and relied on oral communication and memory. Justice in Aksum was administered according to the king's laws and local customs. Disputes between people might be resolved by village elders or brought before royal officials. Serious crimes were punished according to the king's decree. Punishments could include fines, imprisonment, physical punishment, or death, depending on the severity of the crime. Travel within the kingdom was common for merchants and officials, but rare for ordinary farmers. Roads connected major cities and towns, though they were not paved. Merchants traveled in caravans for safety, with armed guards protecting valuable goods from bandits. The journey from the coast up to the highlands could take many days and required careful planning. Travelers needed to bring food and camping supplies and know where water sources were located. Medicine in Aksum combined practical knowledge with religious beliefs. Healers knew about many plants that could be used to treat illnesses. They could set broken bones and treat wounds. Childbirth was attended by experienced women who helped deliver babies and cared for mothers afterward. However, many diseases could not be treated effectively and infant mortality was high. People also prayed for healing and believed that saints and holy men could perform miracles. Despite the challenges of life in ancient times, there was joy and community in Aksumite society. Families gathered for meals and told stories. Neighbors helped each other during harvest time, and when building houses, festivals brought communities together for celebration. Weddings were occasions for feasting and dancing. Children played games in the streets and fields. People found meaning in their faith, their work, and their relationships with others. Although Aksum's power declined after the 7th century, the kingdom's legacy continued to shape the region for centuries to come. The traditions, beliefs, and achievements of Aksum lived on in new forms and influenced the development of Ethiopian civilization. The most enduring legacy of Aksum was Christianity. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church, which traces its origins to the conversion of King Ezana in the 4th century, survived and grew even as Aksum itself declined. the church became the keeper of Aksumite traditions and history. Monasteries preserved manuscripts written in Ge'ez, including religious texts, chronicles, and other writings. These manuscripts kept the memory of Aksum alive through the centuries. The church also maintained architectural traditions that began in Aksum. Ethiopian church architecture developed a distinctive style that can be traced back to Aksumite buildings. The rock-hewn churches of Lalibela, carved from solid stone in the 12th and 13th centuries, show the influence of Aksumite architecture. These churches were literally carved downward into the rock, creating structures that are architectural marvels. The most famous is Bet Georgis, the Church of St. George, which is shaped like a cross. The language of Aksum, Ge'ez, survived as the liturgical language of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. Even though people stopped speaking Ge'ez in everyday life and it was replaced by languages like Amharic and Tigrinya, Ge'ez remained the language of religious services. The Bible, hymnals, and prayer books continued to be written in Ge'ez. Priests learned to read and chant in this ancient language. Preserving a direct link to Aksum-Ethiopian culture retained many elements that originated in Aksum. The distinctive Ethiopian cross, with its elaborate geometric patterns, evolved from the simple crosses of Aksum. Ethiopian religious art, with its unique style of depicting saints and biblical scenes, had roots in Aksumite artistic traditions. Even Ethiopian music, with its distinctive scales and rhythms, can trace some of its characteristics back to ancient practices. New dynasties that ruled in Ethiopia after Aksum's decline claimed descent from the Aksumite kings. The most important of these claims was that the royal family descended from King Solomon of Israel and the Queen of Sheba. According to Ethiopian tradition, the Queen of Sheba visited Solomon in Jerusalem, and they had a son named Menelik. This son supposedly brought the Ark of the Covenant from Jerusalem to Aksum, where it remains hidden to this day in the Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion. Whether or not this story is historically accurate, it was believed by Ethiopians and gave legitimacy to their kings. The Solomonic dynasty, which claimed this ancient lineage, ruled Ethiopia for centuries. The last emperor, Haile Selassie, who was deposed in 1974, claimed to be a direct descendant of Solomon and the Queen of Sheba through the Aksumite royal line. The idea of Ethiopia as a Christian kingdom, surrounded by non-Christian neighbors, shaped Ethiopian identity for centuries. Ethiopians saw themselves as defenders of Christianity in Africa, a role that dated back to Aksum. This identity helped Ethiopia resist colonization in the 19th century when European powers were dividing up Africa. Ethiopia remained independent except for a brief Italian occupation in the 1930s, partly because of its strong sense of identity rooted in its ancient Christian heritage. The ruins of Aksum itself became a sacred site. Pilgrims traveled to the ancient capital to visit the churches there, especially the Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion, believed to house the Ark of the Covenant. The giant stelae, still standing after more than 1,000 years, were reminders of the kingdom's former glory. These monuments inspired awe and pride in visitors who came to see what their ancestors had built. European interest in Aksum began in the 16th century when Portuguese explorers made contact with Ethiopia. They were amazed to find a Christian kingdom in Africa that had existed since ancient times. European scholars began to study Ge'ez and translate Ethiopian texts. In the 19th and 20th centuries, archaeologists came to Aksum to excavate and study the ruins. Their work revealed much about Aksumite civilization and confirmed that the legends about the kingdom's greatness were based in fact. The discovery of Aksumite coins in places far from Ethiopia proved that the kingdom had indeed been a major trading power. Coins found in India, Arabia, and other locations showed that Aksumite merchants had reached distant markets. These physical artifacts connected the legendary kingdom described in old texts to historical reality. Modern Ethiopia takes great pride in its Aksumite heritage. The Ethiopian flag features colors that symbolize different aspects of the nation's history, and Aksum is seen as a foundational chapter in that history. Ethiopian schoolchildren learn about Aksum and its achievements. The ancient kingdom is presented as proof that African civilizations were advanced and powerful long before European colonization. In 1980, UNESCO designated Aksum as a World Heritage Site, recognizing its importance to world history. This designation brought international attention to the ruins and helped fund preservation efforts. The giant stelae, the ruins of palaces, the ancient churches, and the other remains at Aksum are now protected and studied by scholars from around the world. The legacy of Aksum extends beyond Ethiopia itself. The kingdom's role in providing refuge to early Muslims is remembered in Islamic tradition. The fact that a Christian king in Africa protected Muslim refugees from persecution is seen as an example of interfaith tolerance and humanity. This story has helped create a historical connection between Ethiopia and the Muslim world despite the religious differences. Aksum also plays a role in discussions about ancient African civilizations. For too long, Western scholarship ignored or minimized African achievements. The existence of Aksum, with its massive monuments, international trade networks, and literate culture, proves that sophisticated civilizations existed in sub-Saharan Africa in ancient times. Aksum stands alongside Egypt, Kush, and other African kingdoms as evidence of Africa's rich historical heritage. The architectural achievements of Aksum continue to inspire wonder. The question of how ancient Aksumites moved and erected stelae weighing hundreds of tons without modern machinery fascinates engineers and archaeologists. Various theories have been proposed about the techniques used, but some mysteries remain. This enduring fascination ensures that Aksum continues to be studied and discussed. For travelers and pilgrims, Aksum remains a destination. Thousands of people visit the ancient city each year. They walk among the stelae, explore the ruins of palaces, and visit the churches. Ethiopian Orthodox Christians come on pilgrimage to pray at the churches and to be near the place where they believe the Ark of the Covenant rests. Tourists come to witness one of Africa's most impressive ancient sites and to connect with a civilization that flourished more than 1,000 years ago. The legacy of Aksum is alive in the present day through the continued practices of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, through the national identity of Ethiopia, through the physical ruins that still stand, and through the inspiration that this ancient African kingdom provides to people around the world. Aksum may have declined as a political power over 1,000 years ago, but its influence echoes through the centuries. As we reach the end of our journey through the history of Aksum, it is worth reflecting on what this kingdom means and why its story deserves to be remembered. Aksum was once counted among the great powers of the ancient world, yet it remained largely unknown to many people until modern times. This forgotten kingdom has much to teach us about history, civilization, and the complexity of the ancient world. One of the most striking aspects of Aksum is how it challenges simple narratives about history. For too long, the story of civilization was told primarily from a European or Mediterranean perspective. Ancient Greece and Rome were held up as the pinnacles of ancient achievement. Other civilizations were often treated as peripheral or less important. But Aksum shows us that impressive civilizations existed far from the Mediterranean world. The Aksumites built massive stone monuments that rival anything constructed in the ancient world. The engineering skill required to quarry, transport, and erect stelae weighing hundreds of tons was extraordinary. The largest of these monuments, if it had remained standing, would have been taller than any obelisk in Rome. This achievement alone places Aksum among the great building cultures of antiquity. The sophistication of Aksumite trade networks also impresses us. Aksumite merchants traded across the Indian Ocean, connecting markets in Africa, Arabia, India, and beyond. They dealt in luxury goods from multiple continents. Aksumite coins have been found thousands of miles from the kingdom, physical proof of how far their reach extended This was not an isolated or backward society, but one fully engaged with the wider world. The early adoption of Christianity by Aksum is another significant aspect of its history. Aksum was one of the first kingdoms anywhere to make Christianity its official religion. It did so at roughly the same time as the Roman Empire. This makes the Ethiopian Orthodox Church one of the oldest Christian communities in the world. The fact that Christianity has survived in Ethiopia for more than 1,600 years, through all the changes and challenges that time has brought, is remarkable. The story of Aksum also reminds us how fragile even powerful civilizations can be. At its height, Aksum seemed unshakable. It controlled important trade routes, had a powerful army, and built monuments designed to last forever. Yet, within a few centuries, the kingdom had declined dramatically. The rise of Islam changed trade patterns. Internal problems weakened the kingdom. Environmental changes may have played a role. The once great power faded, leaving behind ruins and memories. This rise and fall pattern is common in history, but each instance teaches us something. Aksum's decline was not due to a single catastrophic event, but to multiple factors that accumulated over time. Trade routes shifted, and the kingdom could not adapt quickly enough. The lesson here is that even successful societies must be able to change with changing circumstances. Flexibility and adaptation are essential for long-term survival. Yet Aksum's legacy survived even when its political power did not. The church preserved the culture, language, and traditions. The memory of greatness inspired later generations. Ethiopia maintained its independence and identity partly because of the foundation laid by Aksum. This shows us that a civilization's influence can outlast its political structures. Ideas, beliefs, and traditions can be more enduring than kingdoms and empires. The diversity within Aksum is another aspect worth noting. This was not a homogeneous society. The kingdom included people of different backgrounds, speaking different languages, practicing different trades. It was connected to the Mediterranean world, the Middle East, and the Indian Ocean region. It adapted elements from these various cultures while maintaining its own distinct identity. This cosmopolitan character was a source of strength. The religious tolerance shown by Aksumite kings at certain times is noteworthy. When early Muslims sought refuge from persecution, the king of Aksum protected them. This act of humanity across religious lines is remembered with gratitude to this day. It stands as an example of how leaders can choose compassion over narrow self-interest. In a world often divided by religious differences, this historical example offers hope. The role of individuals in shaping history is evident in the Aksum story. Frumentius, the young man who survived a shipwreck and rose to become a bishop, played a crucial role in bringing Christianity to the kingdom. King Ezana made the decision to adopt Christianity officially. King Kaleb launched the expedition to Yemen. These individuals made choices that shaped the course of history. We are reminded that history is not just about impersonal forces, but also about human decisions and actions. The preservation and study of Aksumite history also teach us about how we recover knowledge about the past. Much of what we know about Aksum comes from archaeology, the careful excavation and study of physical remains. Coins, inscriptions, ruins of buildings, and other artifacts tell us the story. Ancient texts from other cultures that mention Aksum provide additional information. The work of scholars who learned to read Ge'ez and translated Ethiopian manuscripts opened up new sources of knowledge. History is detective work, piecing together evidence from various sources to reconstruct what happened long ago. There is still much we do not know about Aksum. Many questions remain unanswered. How exactly were the massive stelae moved and erected? What caused the initial rise of Aksum as opposed to other communities in the region? What was daily life like for ordinary people? How did the political system actually function? Future research may answer some of these questions, but others may remain mysteries forever. This uncertainty reminds us to be humble about our knowledge and open to new discoveries. As you drift off to sleep tonight, you can take with you the images of this remarkable kingdom. Picture the highlands of East Africa, green and fertile, where farmers worked the land and raised their families. See the city of Aksum with its massive stone stelae reaching toward the sky, monuments to the ambition and skill of their builders. Imagine the bustling port of Adulis, where ships from distant lands arrived carrying exotic goods. Think of the kings in their palaces, the merchants in the markets, the priests in the churches, all playing their parts in this great civilization. Remember that Aksum was real. The people who lived there loved and hoped and worked and dreamed just as we do. They built something impressive that lasted for centuries. Though their kingdom eventually fell, they left behind a legacy that continues to inspire. The story of Aksum is a reminder that greatness can emerge anywhere, and that every culture has contributions to make to the human story. The ruins still stand in northern Ethiopia, silent witnesses to a glorious past. The traditions continue in the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, living connections to ancient times. The memory persists in stories and songs, in books and artifacts. Aksum lives on not as a political power, but as a testament to what humans can achieve when they work together toward great goals. As we close this chapter of history, may the story of Aksum remind you of the richness and diversity of human civilization. May it encourage you to learn more about the many cultures and kingdoms that have shaped our world. And may the peaceful images of this ancient land carry you gently into restful sleep. Good night, and may your dreams be filled with the wonders of the past and the promise of tomorrow.